Welcome to Content Disrupted, bold takes on brand marketing. I'm your host, Dan Baptiste, and together we'll explore what it takes to excel in brand marketing at one of the most exciting and disruptive times in industry history. All right, welcome to Content Disrupted. Today, we're excited to talk to Jessica Gilmartin, who happens to be both the CRO and the CMO at Calendly. Interesting tension there to explore, Jessica. Jessica is in the midst of an incredibly diverse and successful career that's led to unique and innovative approaches to the connections between sales and marketing and product go-to-market, creative campaign development, and really the entire kind of full funnel experience for customers. You're going to want to take notes for this one. So like all of us, Jessica is tasked with doing more with the same or less resources. She's here today to share her blueprint for success and how she does it and share all of her secrets. So Jessica, thrilled to have you on the program. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. So you have a fairly non-traditional background as I was looking at your path in, and you didn't go the kind of step-by-step role that a lot of senior marketers take. So can you start by talking through your career journey to this point and maybe how that shapes your perspective as you come into your role at Calendly?
Yeah, I always joke I have the absolute weirdest background of any CMO industry, which is great because I do think that part of the reason that I enjoy what I do and that I've been successful is because of that background. I think ultimately what I try to bring is a lot of flexibility in the way that I think and a lot of entrepreneurship to the role. I started my career in investment banking, and I think what I learned from that was the ability to just brute force anything, work till the point of death, and a maniacal attention to detail. And I think that those are the three things that I really focus on now. And then after 4 years, realized that I was more passionate and interested in learning about the operating side of the business. So went to Wharton, found marketing and strategy, ended up as a brand manager at Dell for a couple of years. Then my husband and I decided to move out to the Bay Area. And as one does, decided to start a chain of yogurt stores because of
course,
this obvious transition.
Yeah.
And that I did because I had no idea how hard it was to start a business. And I'm really glad I did it. And I really started Fresh Yogurt, which is this yogurt business in the Bay Area, because I have always been passionate about food, about health. And it just seemed like a big hole in the market. And we were very fortunate because we found this opportunity just at the right time. We started it just as this yogurt craze was hitting the Bay Area and hitting the country, and it was a huge success. And I think from there, what I learned was a deep understanding of your ICP. And we did no marketing. We really just opened just on this faith that we understood our customer and we were building everything for that customer. We didn't listen to the common wisdom. We didn't listen to how other experts told us how to do things. We followed our heart and our passion, and it was really successful. So I'll fast forward through that, sold it, ended up at a startup as a first SaaS marketing job and fell in love with it. And then from there, that was a more traditional route and kind of followed that up through an acquisition by Google, then through various COO, CMO, CRO jobs at very small startups up through larger companies like Asana and then finally in Calendly.
What was your experience like as you moved through that acquisition personally, going from a startup to be embedded within Google? Obviously, that culture is famous for being challenging, but in a good way from a growth standpoint. Like, did you have that experience coming in as an acquisition?
It was really hard. And I think we had found at Wildfire, we were in this very fast growing startup where we can move super, super quickly. We felt like we were on top of the world. And I think the big thing is that we had a lot of autonomy and we had a lot of empowerment to just do the things that we needed to do to grow the business and to really have kind of an outsized impact within this very small space of social media marketing. And they were bought by Google. And then we were just this teeny little dot. There's a very large ecosystem. And I think that was a hard balance for us of how do we still be successful in our job? How do we still talk about Wildfire? How do we still make an impact, but as part of a larger organization that is just larger and bureaucratic and moves slower and not as autonomous? And so I think that was a really good opportunity for me to see what marketing looks like at scale and to figure out how are you entrepreneurial? How are you successful? How do you move faster? But in an environment where you have to be collaborative and you have to work across a lot of teams. And I think that helped me a lot in later years of balancing being fast moving and being entrepreneurial, but also being patient and recognizing that not everything can be done immediately. Not everything has to be done immediately. You have to sometimes slow down to get that approval and to get awareness and acceptance by lots of people, which is so much of my job now.
Is that painful to slow down when you're so fast moving?
So painful. And it definitely took me a really long time to accept that. I think you have to constantly balance that of like, you can't be too patient, but you can't be too impatient. And I think that's something that I struggle with a lot.
So, if I get this right, you arrived at Calendly about 2 years after that large funding round. Being in and around the startup community, that's always an interesting tension, right? You get this huge money, comes with huge expectations. You've been running the business as a startup for quote unquote startup. Now you're viewed as a multi-billion-dollar organization. Can you talk about walking into that, what the environment was like, what pressure you faced, what challenges you faced, and how you needed to drive change into the organization, and maybe why you joined there in the first place, given the life stage or growth stage that the company was in?
One of the things that attracted me most about Calendly was that it had been bootstrapped from day one and that it was profitable and it continues to be profitable. Even during the heyday of the sort of pandemic fueled tailwinds, when everybody was doing the growth at all costs, Calendly wasn't. Calendly has always been focused on efficiency and profitability. Having been at multiple very unprofitable startups for quite a few years, I don't think I had realized the impact of being at a profitable company and how important that is. One thing that I really think a lot about is how different my life is and my team's lives are because we're at a company that fundamentally has a solid business model and doesn't have to figure out how to get to profitability. That makes a really big difference in terms of the work that you can do and the investment decisions that you make. And I think the great thing about Tope, our CEO, and the executive team and our board is that they have never changed the way that they work because we took this big funding round. The funding environment and the operating rhythm and model didn't change pre and post funding. I think that's really wonderful. And I wish that other companies follow that discipline, focus on doing the right thing for the business and the customer, and the focus on profitability and operating margins while still obviously thinking about growth and always balancing those two.
It's interesting, right? And like you looked at the roller coaster of low interest rates to high interest rates and the constriction on dry powder and funding, how that's forced behavior to try to hurry up and get profitable and bootstrap, even though you've taken all this funding and now you have this debt. So it's interesting to not have that, right? It's really empowering because the founder and the leadership team and the board were so disciplined. It kind of empowers you now. So as you take the dollars, you can scale without the quote unquote baggage, right? As you're talking about growth and sustainable growth, you're a huge advocate for what's referred to as a product led growth strategy. Can you explain what that means to folks who may not be familiar with that? And when did you get introduced to this concept? Like, how did you embrace it so much?
Yeah. So the more traditional sales and marketing models, which is the world that I came from, really focuses on marketing and selling to one person within an organization, a decision maker. And then that decision maker then says, okay, we are going to implement a technology for the entire organization. To me, the classic examples of that is Workday, which a lot of large organizations use. And an HR team typically decides that they're going to implement Workday for an entire organization. And so that I, as an employee, have no choice or no say whether I like Workday or not. And so marketing and sales have to work very closely hand in hand for many months to identify one specific decision maker and get them through this long considered process. It works great in many ways, but also it takes a really long time. And you might have 5 or 6 deals in the works for years, and maybe you get one of them. What I love about PLG is that to me, I always say it's the democratization of purchasing technology. And so it really requires a product team to build a product that individual users love. And individuals within a company are the ones that decide whether that technology is going to be used or not. So it looks and feels very much like a consumer purchase. So our job as marketers is really just to help somebody understand why they would use a product for themselves. Then, once they've used it for themselves and get value, why it would make sense for them to then share it with other team members so that teams can get value. And then, as it percolates and spreads throughout an organization, usually organically and virally, then our job, marketers and salespeople, is to say, hey, now there's large pockets within one organization that are using our product. Now, how do we consolidate it? How do we get somebody at that senior level to see that many people within an organization are getting value from it? So maybe there's an enterprise license that everybody within the organization can do. So it's much more complicated and windy and twisty to ultimately get to that decision maker. But that path to me is actually quite interesting and requires a lot of innovation and creativity and collaboration with sales and product to get there.
And how long does that take?
Typically, to get from that individual user to that enterprise decision maker, what I have seen is typically 12 to 24 months.
And when you're thinking of this sort of bottoms up versus the top down approach, how do you get a user population in enough of a groundswell to get the attention of a senior person? Is that make it easier to sell to virtually every category in the market because everybody is a user? Or is it more complicated because there isn't a sort of set time or infrastructure or revenue expectation because it's unpredictable? Like, is it easier or harder? Like, what are the trade-offs there as you're thinking about it?
It's much harder.
Okay.
Much, much harder because in a typical sort of tops down motion, you have one very clear ICP, so customer persona. I've done this before. I sold software to recruiters at Piazza, which was a recruiting software technology. And you knew exactly the way recruiters thought. You knew exactly the messaging that made sense to them. You had very clear comparables and logos. Like it was very much a rinse and repeat. When you have a bottoms up model, you have literally hundreds of ICPs and you have every single possible industry and persona and use case. And so it's literally impossible for you to create a repeatable playbook. You can't do it. And then when you're thinking about your ad targeting, you're thinking about your case studies and your messaging and your activation playbook, you have to just fork into so many different directions and you have to make a lot of really tough choices and say, okay, we know we're not going to be able to get to every use case and industry. How do you segment them intelligently? How much do you segment? Should you do generic use cases? Should you do generic targeting? Or do you have to do these very specific target, knowing that you're not going to be able to hit probably 50 to 60% of the personas that use you? So you have to make a lot tougher prioritization and trade-offs in a bottoms up model.
To that point, where is the line that you're seeing? So obviously, you hear so much about personalization, and you're, in this case, impossible for the most part to personalize down to that micro ICP. Are you personalizing to roles and use cases? Do you get all the way to industries and roles and use cases within those industries? Like, at what point is the juice not worth the squeeze? And what does that line look like to you?
So, what I have typically seen from my personal use, as well as companies that I have worked with, is you want to get at most 2 to 3 industries that you're going to focus on. And those tend to be very clear use cases. So, from Calendly's perspective, financial services is a huge industry for us. And it's a pretty common use case. So, that's the good thing is that we can do industry targeting and it generally looks the same. So, we can do it. Then there are a couple of other industries like professional services. And even that is hard because professional services then breaks down to lawyers and accountants. So you go down a rat hole pretty quickly. And so we try to be pretty disciplined and say we're really going to only focus on like 2 professional services industries and financial service and say that's really all that we can do. And if the use cases are relatively homogenous within an industry, then it makes sense to try to do that. Then from a persona perspective, you can typically only get maybe 3 to 4 personas. But again, the use cases have to be pretty homogenous within that persona for you to be able to target them well. Otherwise, you're going to be trying to speak to people and the use case doesn't make a lot of sense to them. It's not going to be relevant.
So if that's the case, Why go at this bottoms up approach versus a clear kind of top down? Like, what are the benefits? I've heard the frustration. And when we're thinking of why this is an attractive path, like, what would you say to that?
Well, it's all about CAC. It's all about customer acquisition costs. And the CAC for a bottoms up model should be almost nothing. And so that's the huge advantage is that from a capital perspective, it should be much less. And also the ability to have it spread within an organization that again should be almost free. And so that's really the big difference. It's just the deployment of capital should be dramatically less with a bottoms up model than with a top down model. I also think it's great because you get a ton more data and validation about product market fit and then you do from a tops down because users are choosing to use you and you see right away whether you have value there.
So you mentioned CAC is almost nothing. What are the tactics that work? Do you need a freemium model? What are some of the common practices when you're looking at customer acquisition?
What's wonderful at Calendly and which is truly unique is that we literally have zero acquisition costs. And every time I tell a marketer this, they just die with envy.
Do they throw tomatoes at you?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I hide as I tell them this because we have such a viral product. Everybody knows Calendly because everybody has gotten a Calendly link. And when you get a Calendly link, you think, God, this is magical. Why am I not using a Calendly solution? And you go on and you sign up. And so that is an incredible acquisition model for us. And so a freemium model is super important for us because our customers are our marketers. And so the most valuable thing for us is to get as many meetings as possible scheduled with Calendly. And then what happens in certain industries like education, like financial services, is people say, why are you not using Calendly? Like my previous financial advisors use Calendly. Why are you not doing that? And so they feel this pressure to be using it. And then the most colleges, for example, they have to be really competitive. And so when other colleges are using Calendly for admissions and for counseling, they look and say, hey, we have to be competitive. We have to be modern. We have to use it. And so that's, to me, that's the dream. That's the ideal state is you have users that are marketing for you because you have something that is incredibly valuable. So that's like number one above any other innovation on models, on pricing, is really thinking about the product value and what value users are getting from it. And is there virality? And the way that I think about it a lot is internal virality versus external virality. And so Calendly has like off the charts external virality. There are other products that have really strong internal virality. So maybe a little bit harder to get that first user, but there's so much value from that user spreading it within an organization, collaborating with an organization that internally it's super viral. Slack is probably the best example of that. Asana was another great example of that, where you have advocates that are saying you have to use this product because it's so amazing. And so they are very invested in getting other people within the organization to use it, and it grows that way. So I'd say like number one is thinking about that from a product perspective, the value that you drive. And then number two is thinking about the model that makes sense. And yes, absolutely, you need to figure out how does somebody see the value of your product before they pay. And there's so many different ways. And I think that's just really an experimentation and also thinking about what's the value that you drive. So for Calendly, because external virality is so important to us, we have a really juicy freemium model where there are people that have used us for years and years. They get so much value out of Calendly, but they don't pay for it because they use us in a way that's free. So I think it's just very dependent upon the company, their business model, their product that should drive the business model.
And can you design for that, either internal or external virality? Or is it you have to get a product in market, find fit, find how people are using it, see where the value lies, and then react? Or can you start to think through that from the beginning and say, how do we almost build this future that we want?
I think you should have a vision of what that would look like. But I think the best thing to do is just get something out in the market. I think it's hard and dangerous to over engineer from the beginning because that goes back to like, hey, you've got a limited amount of money, a limited amount of time. And I also think what's dangerous is trying to promote virality and trying to get people to use the more expensive premium features before they've seen value from the free stuff. And I've seen that happen a lot. I've seen people make that mistake a lot, which is they're so focused on the things that they want their customers to do, that they're not actually focused on what their customers want to do. Like you have to be driven by what the customers want, not what you want them to do.
How have you seen the balance there? Because we're all, at the end of the day, we're in a business. We have to generate revenue. So the fastest path to revenue is getting them to do what you want them to do versus, to the point earlier, the patience to observe and almost react to how folks are using the technology and the platform. Like, how do you exercise patience or communicate that long-term vision? Like, what are some of the key pillars there as a leader to help shepherd an organization down this path?
I think the best thing is people will often try things and see that they don't work. Right. And so I have seen that many times within my organization with my leaders is they will be impatient. They will have you try things that don't work. And I think sometimes you just have to say yes. And what I have learned over time as a marketer, as a senior marketer, is that sometimes it's just not worth fighting. And I talk a lot about this with my team. I talk a lot about this idea of a one-way door and a two-way door. And I did not make this up, I stole it. But it's a great concept, which is this idea that you have decisions that are very difficult to revoke. And those are one-way doors, which is you go through it once and it's actually like really hard to go back. And then there are decisions that are two-way doors that are like super easy. You make them and you're like, okay, you know what? We made a mistake and you reverse them. And in my younger years, when I had a lot less patience, I would fight for everything, even if it was a two-way door decision. And now what I realize is sometimes it's just okay to go along with a recommendation, knowing that it may not be the right one, but it just stops the conversation. You don't have to fight about it. So sometimes it's okay to say, hey, you know what? I don't believe in this. I don't think it's going to work, but let's just try this. And I think sometimes I've been absolutely wrong and I've learned something, but sometimes I've been right. And if you are right often enough, if you have a good leader, they will recognize that and you will gain that credibility. The important thing is making the decision, looking at the results, and being very honest about whether they worked or not. We talk about being entrepreneurial. That's a philosophy that I use a lot, which is just make a decision. Even if you're not 100% bought in, just do it. But the most important thing is looking at the results and being intellectually honest. Even if it was your suggestion, if it was wrong, I was wrong. And then you move on. So that would be my number one advice is sometimes you just have to try things and it's okay if you don't believe it.
I also heard you speak about a really fascinating concept. And what I'm hearing a lot of is confidence in exploring new things, right? Whether it's leaving investment banking, finding yourself in other environments, keeping yourself open-minded, learning and growing, not having a set point of view, which I think has served you incredibly well as you've architected teams and structures and philosophies. One of which you've coined is creative destruction, which sounds cool and dangerous. Can you explain that concept so that we can unpack it a little bit?
Yeah, one of the things that I love about marketing and what keeps me doing this is that everything changes all the time. I truly can't think of another discipline that has changed as much since I joined and started doing marketing 15 years ago as marketing has. And that's what I love about it. And I look for people like me who embrace this change and want to constantly rethink what they're doing and do it better and do it differently. And so when I think about creative direction, what I have told my team is that, every single quarter, we should be changing 70% of the things that we do. And that doesn't mean that we're scratching everything and we're super chaotic. We are constantly reevaluating everything that we're doing and we're scrapping most of what we're doing. And that's really exciting. And I think my team loves that because it allows them to be really innovative and experimental. And also, we recognize that most of what we're doing probably won't work, and that's okay. But what's exciting and fun is when we find the things that do work and we make a really big impact. And I honestly don't know in the 2 years I've been at Calendly, I don't know if there's a single person on my team who still has the same job that they had when I joined. I think it's fantastic. It's because we're constantly looking at the things we're doing and saying, does this make sense? You also have to have amazing analysts and great data and a data-driven culture and a no ego team and a team that is not wedded to what they're doing, which is hard to find. And we hire for that and we retain people that have that mentality.
Speaking of that, when you came into Calendly, did the team embody that or did you have to start over with a new and different team?
The team had all the raw ingredients. They just hadn't baked properly. I was very fortunate. I had a phenomenal team and really just took me a long time to build the team in the way that made sense. I believe every organization is unique and you have to really understand the culture, understand the people, understand the needs of that organization, and do whatever you possibly can to keep great people and to motivate them and to promote them. I'm just a really big believer in that.
So if I hop back to this concept of 70 to 80% new-ish activity or modifying current activity or things like that, can you give some examples of that? I don't think what you're saying is like, hey, we're essentially starting our marketing plan over every quarter with something we've never done before. I wanted to understand, what do you mean by 70 to 80% new? And then as you're changing at that level of innovation or disruption, whatever we want to kind of coin that is, how do we think about capturing and repeating what actually does work and retaining that? Like, how do you balance that in a culture where you're dropping a bomb and rebuilding, dropping a bomb and rebuilding? Like, can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, and I definitely wouldn't say that it was like dropping a bomb and rebuilding. It to me, it's much more evolutionary, and it's basically planting seeds every quarter that then grow. And sometimes you're like, hey, the seeds aren't working, right? It's not budding, and so we're going to pull those out. And sometimes it's let's put lots of water on the seed because it's going to grow into a huge, beautiful tree, and it's going to be very successful. So that's how kind of we think about it. So I guess a class example for us over the past probably 6 to 9 months. And by the way, this is not me mostly driving it. This is me encouraging my team to come up with ideas, and then we prioritize them and we fund them. I certainly am not going to take credit for my team's great work, but a great example is influencers. And what we had noticed through surveys of our customers, as well as obviously just looking out in the market, is that social, whether it's LinkedIn or whether it's YouTube or Instagram, that's just where more and more people are looking for information about technology and about purchases. And so we said, hey, we've got people that already work on social, we've got people that work in PR. Why don't we start to dabble in influencer marketing and paid influencer marketing, organic influencer marketing? So let's just find one person and see how that goes. And that felt like that was successful. And then we started to say, what are KPIs that we want to measure this and say, this is worth the investment? Those seem to all pan out in terms of like, we seem to be hitting our KPIs, exceeding them, getting good feedback from customers, getting good engagement, seeing results. So let's then invest more in that. And so over the past 6 to 9 months, we've just invested more and more in influencer marketing. So it went from it's an experiment to it's a core part of our strategy. And as we're looking at that, we're saying people that have typically worked in traditional PR, is PR actually serving our needs anymore? Like, is that where our customers are? Is that where they're getting information? Are we seeing that is meaningful to us and driving results? And we started to think maybe we can decelerate PR and accelerate influencer and move some of those folks from traditional PR to influencer. So that's what we've done. And so when you look at the transition from 6 to 9 months ago to now, it hasn't felt that way because it has been a slow, I would say not like a slamming of the gas, but a slow break and like a slow acceleration.
So if I understand this right, you're still investing heavier in influencer, but every month or every quarter, you're looking and saying, okay, how do we go bigger or differently? How do we make influencer more effective versus just saying, all right, this works, let's keep it going, ignore it and move on to the next thing? Like there's no autopilot in your teams from what I'm hearing. Is that true?
There's no autopilot, zero.
How does your team keep up with that? Is it just creative curiosity? Are they just really smart and entrepreneurial, as you put it? Like, what are the ways that you allow your team to flourish and give them the tools that they need to be successful?
So, number one thing is always funding professional development. I'm a really big believer in that. So, any conference they want to go to, any class they want to go to, anything that they want to take. I also am constantly using my network. So, for example, I'm the influencer again, rather than just starting it from scratch, I'll tap my network and say, hey, who has done this? And I'll connect them so that they can start to build that knowledge from people that have done that before. I feel like that's a really important part of my job is to create those connections with other experts outside the organization. And then one thing that to me is the most important thing and I prioritize above everything else is communication. So marketing tends to be very siloed. And I've seen that within almost every organization I've worked at. People work in these silos. They don't talk to each other. They don't share best practices. They don't share learnings. And I just am such a big believer in everybody having access to information, everybody seeing what's worked, what hasn't worked. People can jump in. And what you find sometimes is like, you didn't realize that the person that came on as your content marketer used to be an expert in demand gen. And so when you share the things that you're working on and you share problems and opportunities, then you can mine these great minds and experiences from everybody within the organization. And they all love it. They love to jump in. They love to help. They love to support, do things outside of their day job. And so I think that's been really fun to see how everybody has like chips in with great ideas, and like they're all much more creative than I am. They all have much deeper experience than I am. And so I try to stay out of it and just create an environment where everybody else can jump in and support each other.
I love that. I think if you look in any work environment, there's probably tons of folks who are under leveraged and they're not leaning into their passions or even a lot of what success they could bring to an organization because they're stuck in a role that they can't break out of. Can you give any practical advice on how to actually do that? Like, are there specific approaches or tactics to foster this level of communication? And part of that, I would assume, comes with honesty and transparency so that people crave feedback. How do you balance that with, I would say, a culture that has gotten away from honest feedback? If you look more holistically, it's less common than it is natural. How do you manage all of those things?
Yes. So when I came into the organization, nobody had ever given each other feedback. That was not the like sort of culture of our team, giving each other direct and honest feedback. And I've talked to a lot of folks within the team, and they have talked about how much they appreciate that I give them direct feedback. And so I just model it. I do it all the time. I reward it when I see it. So when someone says, hey, this person gave me this really hard feedback, I will immediately thank that other person for giving them the feedback. So it makes sure that people know it's seen and that they're not getting punished for it. I also implemented 360 feedback. I brought in third-party guest speakers to actually do sessions on how to give constructive feedback. I've assigned books about feedback. Like I really have made it a cornerstone of the work that if I were a politician, this would be my platform.
Award yogurt for good behavior as well.
Yes, exactly. And I think the second thing is that I will always be the first to admit when I made a mistake. And I will share all the instances in the past when I have done things wrong and made mistakes. And there have been plenty. And I think people see that and they're like, okay, if Jessica, our leader, is sharing all the times she made mistakes and the ways that she was wrong, then I can do it. I can be safe to do that. So that's actually a really important part of what I do. And even when I have said, hey, we should try this, if it's wrong, then I will be the first person to say, this was wrong. This is why. This is what we learned. This is what we're going to do differently. And so that's number one, just being open and honest yourself. And that creates that environment. I think number two is just investing a ton in data and analysts. We have invested an enormous amount relative to our resources in data, in dashboards, in people. And we have really created a data-driven culture that we didn't have before. And it's much easier to be able to, look at decisions objectively and make decisions objectively when you have the data. Otherwise, it's just opinion and ego, and no one is going to win that way. And I think the final thing is I have a lot of communication forums that enable people to share. So our weekly all hands, I send out a weekly newsletter to my team every Friday. These are the things that I'm working on. These are the things that I'm seeing. These are things that you should be thinking about. And all of my leaders now do that as well. And so each of my leaders go into much more tactical plans about, hey, these are the things that my team is working on, links to our Asana projects. Everybody can jump in, see the projects, ask questions. So for me, it's all about communication. I prioritize it above almost everything else.
And all of the teams run all those communications, or is that just a leadership?
Every single person is on that.
If I hear you right, you almost embrace taking risk, learning from that risk and evolving. Am I understanding your philosophy?
Yes. What I tell my team is the only thing I know for sure is that I'll be wrong. I don't know how I'll be wrong or how much I'll be wrong, but I know I'll be wrong because you don't know how people think. And consumers are totally unpredictable. And you could see that, which is the smartest marketing minds, the smartest business minds have gotten it wrong many times. The smartest investors have gotten it wrong many times. And so the only thing I know is that consumers or customers act in unpredictable ways. We can take our best guess. And I think we need to make informed decisions. And then we will put it out there and we will see how we were wrong. And then we will adapt to it. And hopefully we got a kernel right. And we can take that kernel and we can build on that. And then we keep iterating until we get something that feels really good. It feels really right.
And that's right back to your creative destruction, right? The
Yes.
kernel could be a seed. The seed plants, we water, becomes a beautiful tree.
Metaphors. That's
Yeah,
right.
I'm with you. I'm tracking. I'm here to shepherd. You mentioned a lot of teams that you're managing in a lot of functional areas. Can you talk about from a tactics standpoint? Obviously, within marketing, there tend to be a lot of silos. And obviously, you were thinking of brand marketing and demand gen and social and all these other elements. How do you divide out your marketing spend and tactics among those kind of tier of activities?
The first thing I do is I start with what are my commitments to the business. So it's a long conversation with the finance team around what do they actually need for us to drive from a sign up perspective, a lead perspective, and then from a financial perspective, what do I need to do to drive that? So I really start with the demand gen piece and really the direct lead, the direct search piece, because that's the most important thing is I want to make sure that before I allocate anything else, I am fulfilling my commitments to the business that my CEO and my CFO are expecting from me. And I'm just trying to do that as efficiently as I possibly can and assuming that I'm going to be able to get some efficiency from that. Then it's really about advocating with my CFO and my CEO about all the other things that I think are important to the business. And that's the stuff that you can't measure and are not going to have a direct bottom line result, but that are important for the long term health of the business. And those are all the brand investments, the PR, the influencer, the product marketing. And typically, what I do is I will try to gather the asks from my team first about what they would like to fund for the next year. And then I aggregate that and then have conversation with the other executives around why these things are important. So it's a little bit different probably than how some people do it. But I think it's to me, to build a long-term sustainable business, you have to invest in brand. You have to invest in things that are not going to drive immediate bottom line results. And I think it's doing you and your team a disservice if you try to make up some number that brand spend drives the bottom line. It's very hard to do. And I don't think it's going to be successful long term. Like you can maybe get away with it for 1 year, but then the next year, your CEO and your CFO are going to say, hey, we didn't see X% return on your brand spend. We're going to cut it. And I think it's just much better to have the conversation of, I'm not going to promise you any short term results, but this is why it's important in the long term.
I love that perspective. I think it's really interesting. It's like eat your vegetables and then you can have whatever else you like, unless you really like vegetables. I know you're really healthy, Jessica. Starting to not attribute brand marketing to direct response outcomes, I think is untethering that. But I would also be curious or challenge this idea of like one without the other doesn't work, right? So have you seen a correlation, a really healthy brand helps stimulate all of the account-based marketing and demand gen efforts if everything is purely demand gen with no brand equity or loyalty or affinity, like good luck, it's all price and promotion, or otherwise you're in a quote unquote fluffy brand environment with no direct correlation back to the business, that doesn't work either. To your point, you might have a 1 to 2 year term and then they say, thanks for your service, but here's the door. So would you agree with that approach? And is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah. And there's a really interesting new world of like marketing mix modeling, which is trying to say, hey, if you're investing in billboards, if you're investing in top of funnel, if you're investing in connected TV and TV ads, all these things, what's the direct revenue impact? I think we're pretty nascent there. So I'm confident that at some point we're going to get to a world where we can measure top of funnel spend. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think trying to have that argument with a CEO and CFO is a tough one to have. And I believe it. So I very firmly believe that brand spend drives immediate results. It's just very difficult to measure right now. And so it's just not a conversation that I want to have because I only want to have conversations with my CEO and CFO that I can justify because credibility is like the most important thing. And when you just say things like, I believe it and I feel it, and like, why wouldn't you just give me this money? It's not helpful.
And they say, I don't believe it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's not a helpful conversation. And it just, I think, puts me in the back foot. So I'd rather just, even though I believe it, I'd rather just separate those conversations because I can't right at this moment justify it and prove it.
sure. I think that's smart. You mentioned performance and measurement and having a team of analysts. What are some of the things you're measuring? And are those things consistent throughout the year? Or as you're changing, your creative destruction is creating new activities, does that change what you measure? Or do you measure a consistent set of KPIs and data sets continually?
Yeah, we try to keep them consistent throughout the year, but it changes depending on what we're measuring. So when we're looking at these brand investments, where we're looking at content, we're looking at impressions, we're looking at engagements, we're looking at direct spend, obviously, and leads, we're looking at hard measurements like pipeline and sign up spend and CAC. So I think it's important to measure things consistently over time because people need to have a benchmark and people need to know what they're trying to achieve. But I think it's very dangerous if you are trying to measure, for example, content creation to Google search. Like those things are never going to be the same. If you did that, you would never invest in content, you'd never invest in social because they would never look good.
If we move over to your new role, which is owning both revenue and marketing, often those two sort of functions are at odds. And I think maybe that's because it's like a credit issue, maybe and that gets back to ego, right? Like, no, I brought this in. And they're like, no, I did. And look at it, came in through this channel. What have you learned by integrating? One, are the teams integrated? And two, if they are, like, what have you learned by moving into a shared function here? And has that changed how you think about team composition and structure and roles and things like that? Like, what's that experience been like for you?
Yeah, so I have really loved having both teams. And I was very nervous about taking on sales, but it's really been wonderful. And it's been wonderful not only for me, but for the teams. And I think, especially in a PLG, SLG hybrid, where you have mostly a bottoms up model, but you also have a sales motion, it's actually fantastic to have the teams working together because you're making decisions that are best for the company and not best for one versus the other. And so I think one of the big challenges in this model is trying to understand, when do you drive a customer to sign up versus when do you drive a customer to a salesperson as a lead. It's super, super difficult. It's very complex and it's very controversial when you have a sales team. It's very difficult conversations when you're a marketer who's saying, hey, like this is probably best for the company and it's the most efficient for the company for them to not go to sales, but then you've got a sales leader who has a bunch of mouths to feed. And so those are very difficult. But when you have everything under one roof, then you are making decisions that make sense for the company and not for just one team. So to me, that's probably the biggest advantage of having them all under one roof. And you are right sizing the sales team and right sizing the budget for the leads and not the other way around. That has been one of the best things that we have seen, is that we are making sure that our lead volume is appropriate for our sales team, that we're not overspending on leads. So our efficiency is super high. And that, to me, most importantly, we're doing what's right for the customer. So if the customer really wants to sign up and use the product, even if they are a director at a Fortune 500 company, we're not forcing them to talk to a salesperson. Many companies would. We're just letting them sign up. And if a small mom and pop wants to talk to a salesperson, well, we're probably not going to let them do that. But we have other ways. We have very cost effective ways to get them to talk to someone in customer support so that they get their questions answered. So to me, that's been the absolute best result, is just that we're making much better decisions for the company and much better decisions for our customers.
All right. So you're not at Calendly. You are, but this is a fictitious example. I'm not telling you any new information. You're a marketer that's responsible for a full go-to-market. You want to move into maybe this PLG style model, but none of that exists today. What are the foundational things you should start putting into place to try to conquer this? And what are the watch outs or the dangers that people need to be aware of?
So the most important thing is really thinking through your customer journey and making sure that you have all of the touch points available, because user acquisition is just the first component of PLG. So in a typical SLG model, like marketers basically stop once they've gotten the lead. That is not the case at all. That is the first step in a PLG model. And you have to think about getting the person to the website, getting them to sign up, getting them to activate, getting them to convert, getting them to retain. And that requires different skill sets, different teams, different technology, different data. Your data sources often aren't speaking to each other. And so you've got to knit that all together so you can have a full picture of the customer journey. And then you have to build relationships with product in a way that you haven't before, and customer support so that you are understanding roles and responsibilities, because they can get very messy. And you're also not either forgetting important parts of the customer journey, or you're not stepping over each other and overlapping, which can often happen. At a previous company, we discovered that we were sending like 60 to 70 emails to customers in the first few weeks because all these different teams were sending emails but not talking to each other. That's bad. You don't want to do that.
Nightmare. Obviously, you've gotten incredibly skilled at this approach. Are there resources or books or mentors or any of that you could point people to say, hey, I would love to learn more or get good at this, but I don't have the experience that Jessica has? Like, are there any resources you would point people toward?
The absolute best person right now is Kyle Pouliar, who is at OpenView, and he has a blog called Growth Unhinged. And he just has the absolute best stuff. He talks to all the smartest people in the industry and writes these super, super detailed write-ups on their models. So you can find him on LinkedIn or on Substack, but he's a good friend. He's awesome. And I highly recommend him.
Awesome. Any last thoughts or recommendations as folks are trying to tackle this complicated, fast-moving train or bus or moped or whatever it is that we're on in marketing? Like, any final thoughts here to leave folks with?
I see you have gotten on my bad metaphor train. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. I can't let you die alone. Yeah.
I would say the number one thing is what I tell everybody is focus on your customer. If you focus on your customer, you have much less chance of going wrong. Don't focus on what you want the customer to do. Don't focus on your efficiency, your growth, what your boss is telling you that you should do. Focus on the customer, understand your customer deeply, understand their motivations, understand their journey, and build for that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Jessica. This has been incredible. I think there's a lot of really actionable things here, and really appreciate sharing your thoughts, your leadership in this very wide-ranging conversation. So I think folks are going to get a lot out of this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Content Disrupted, brought to you by Skyward. To stay up to date on the latest ideas and insights in brand building and content marketing, visit our website at skyward.com. That's skyword.com. Join us for our next episode, where we'll continue to challenge marketing norms and inspire you with fresh strategies for growing business through brand storytelling.